All right, so we are reading Gooney Bird and the Room Mother, and we are on chapter 4 today. So I'm going to scoot my camera up so that you can read with me. And we know that Gooney Bird's been bringing a lot of new vocabulary to her classmates. Chapter 4. Not a single mom wanted to be room mother. Not one. Oh dear, Mrs. Pigeon said with a sigh. She looked at the board where the word cajole was carefully printed near the end of the word list, just above admonition. I guess cajoling doesn't always work. Well, said Tricia from her desk, we learned a new word anyways. That's always a good thing. Mrs. Pigeon nodded. True, she said. And you know, class, they say that if you use a new word 3 times, it is yours forever. Who says that? Asked Bernie. I don't know, Mrs. Pigeon said. They. Barry Tuckerman stood suddenly beside his desk. Cajole, 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 he said loudly. Now it's mine forever. No one else is allowed to say it. That isn't what I meant, Barry. You do not own the word. We all may use it. And in fact, class, I wish you would try a little more cajoling at home. This is the only class in Water Tower Elementary School that does not have a room mother yet. Mr. Leroy is becoming a little impatient about it. Now, though, I think we ought to start our preparations for the Thanksgiving pageant. The mural is coming along well, but we have a song to learn and costumes to make, and I have to select the cast. I already have a cast, Ben called out, holding up his arm. Ben had fallen from his bike a month earlier and broken his wrist. All of the children and Mrs. Pigeon and even the principal, Mr. Leroy, had signed their names on the cast using different colored markers. The names were faded now, and the cast itself, which had once been white, was gray and dirty with bits of string like dental floss dangling from it. Keiko wrinkled her nose and said, Your cast smells bad, Ben. I know, said Ben, making a face, but next week the doctor takes it off. Your arm will be all skinny and wrinkled inside it when they take it off, Barry Tuckerman told him. My cousin had a cast on his arm, and his arm died inside the cast. Is that true, Mrs. Pigeon? Ben asked nervously. Your arm is probably dead already, probably green, Barry added. Ben's face began to pucker up. My arm is dead? Green? He wailed. Children, Mrs. Pigeon said. No, Ben, your arm will be fine. Besides, I'm talking about a different kind of cast. We need a cast of characters for the pageant. We need pilgrims and Native Americans. We also need a turkey. And let me see, some succotash and a pumpkin pie. But the food items don't have to be human beings. I want to be Squanto, Gooney Bird said. I love Squanto. He was always absolutely right smack in the middle of everything. Squanto's a boy, Barry called out. Only a boy can be Squanto, right, Mrs. Pigeon? Actually, Mrs. Pigeon said, I've already made a list, so put your hands down, everyone. She read the list aloud. There were 22 children in the classroom, and each was on the list, 11 pilgrims and 11 Native Americans. But who is Squanto? The children asked. Mrs. Pigeon looked around the class. Now every child, not just Gooney Bird and Barry, was waving an arm in the air, volunteering eagerly to be Squanto. I haven't decided yet, said Mrs. Pigeon, but I have an idea. She went to the board to the list of words. Reward, she wrote. You all know what a reward is, Mrs. Pigeon said. Money, shouted Ben. $1,000 if you catch a criminal. Well, Mrs. Pigeon said, it could be that, but a reward doesn't have to be about criminals. Let's look it up. Everyone opened their dictionaries and turned the pages. Chelsea raised her hand first. That which is given in appreciation, she read aloud to the class. You see, it doesn't have to be money, Mrs. Pigeon explained. And in this case, the reward I'm going to give is the important role of Squanto in the pageant. Someone is going to get that role in appreciation. It will be that person's reward. Reward for what? Several children asked at the same time. For catching a criminal? No, Mrs. Pigeon said. She sighed. For finding me a room mother. An hour later, after lunch, the second graders were learning one of the songs for the Thanksgiving pageant. It was a complicated song that Mrs. Pigeon herself had written. The Pilgrims sang half and the Native Americans sang half. The song was about food. Succotash, lima beans and corn. Mrs. Pigeon, oh, there they are all singing. Mrs. Pigeon played the notes on the piano and sang the words. To the tune of Jingle Bells, she explained. Ready, Native Americans? This is your part. Try it with me. 11 children, including Gooney Bird, sang the succotash lines. Oh, so it'd probably be like, instead of Jingle Bells, succotash, lima, beans, and corn. Got it. 11, let's see. Now, pilgrims, listen to your part. Just like the next two lines of Jingle Bells, Mrs. Pigeon played and sang. Thank you for the vegetables on this Thanksgiving morn. The pilgrims sang loudly. Now the next verse is about the turkey. Native Americans, ready and listen carefully. Gooney Bird raised her hand. Does Squanto sing with the Native Americans? She asked. No, actually, while the Pilgrims and Native Americans are singing, Squanto will be carrying the food across the stage. Perhaps Squanto will do some sort of dance. I haven't worked out the details yet. Beanie, standing with the Pilgrims, raised her hand. I take ballet lessons, she said. Maybe I could be. Mrs. Pigeon shook her head. Not ballet, Beanie, she said. They don't have ballet in Plymouth. All right, class, let's pay careful attention to this next part. Still the tune of Jingle Bells. Remember? Gobble, gobble, here it comes, turkey roasted brown. She played the melody on the piano while she sang the songs. Then the 11 Native Americans sang it after her. Mrs. Pigeon, may I be excused? Gooney Bird said politely. I need to be excused. Mrs. Pigeon paused with her hands on the piano keys. Is this a seriously urgent need? She asked. Yes. All right then, be quick. Gooney Bird slipped out of the classroom while Mrs. Pigeon sang on. Thank you, noble Squanto. You may set the platter down. The children were still singing and passing imaginary helpings of food around when Gooney Bird returned a few minutes later. Announcement, Gooney Bird said in a loud voice. Important announcement. Mrs. Pigeon stopped playing the piano. The room became quiet. All the children knew that when Gooney Bird had an announcement to make, it was worth listening to. I am Squanto, Gooney Bird announced. But, Mrs. Pigeon began. I got us a room mother, Gooney Bird said proudly. Mrs. Pigeon clapped her hands. But how? She asked. Simple phone call. They let me use the telephone in the office. I told Muriel Holloway it was an emergency. Mrs. Pigeon frowned slightly. Well, she said, it was beginning to feel like an emergency, actually. But, so now I'm Squanto, right? Wait, Gooney Bird, you haven't told us who our room mother is. I'll write it down, Gooney Bird Greene said. She went to the board and picked up the chalk. Class, she said, get out your dictionaries. She wrote a word very carefully on the board at the end of the list. She wrote the word incognito. This is our room mother's name, she said. Do any of you guys know what incognito means? It means like in disguise or like undetected. All right, chapter 5. With the identity disguised or hidden, Mrs. Pigeon read to the class from the dictionary. So our room mother doesn't want us to know who she is? Or he, she added, remembering Bailey Stevenson's father. It's a she, Gooney said. I think it's okay to tell you that. But you're right, she wants it to be a secret. How did you cajole her? Trisha asked. Is it my mom? I couldn't cajole her. How did you? Is it mine? Barry asked. I'll bet it's mine. Did you pay her? Tyrone asked. If you paid her, it's mine. My lips are sealed, Gooney said. Maybe it's mine, Keiko said. Maybe mine, whispered Felicia Ann. Oh, I hope mine. Malcolm was rolling a piece of paper into a tube that looked like a telescope. Malcolm had a very hard time keeping his hands still. He called out loudly, if it's my mom and if she brings those 3 babies to this school, he scowled and sputtered and wrinkled his face and couldn't decide what he would do. Sealed, Gooney repeated. What are the babies' names? Felicia Ann asked Malcolm. I love babies. I'm not saying, Malcolm replied with a scowl. My lips are sealed. Mrs. Pigeon began to laugh. Well, class, Malcolm is not going to reveal the triplets' names, and Gooney is not going to reveal the identity of our room mother, though I somehow suspect that it might be someone who has decided that she doesn't want to be the chief or the chef at the White House. She looked at Gooney who shook her head. Tightly sealed, she said. Well, I'm delighted that we have one, Mrs. Pigeon said, and I want to notify Mr. Leroy. But Gooney would you tell us, without revealing the name, of course, the absolutely true story of how you cajoled her? Gooney nodded. I guess I could do that, she said. She was already standing in the center of the room, and she began to take deep breaths, as she always did when beginning a story. The Pilgrims and the Native Americans sat down on the floor. Keiko clapped her hands in delight, and Malcolm stopped rolling the piece of paper into a tube. Barry crept over to his desk and sat down quietly. Mrs. Pigeon turned around on the piano bench to listen. How Gooney Got a Room Mother is the title, Gooney began. Sometimes, she explained, a title should be a little mysterious. It should make you wonder what the story is about. I could have called this one An Exciting Phone Call, or maybe Incognito, called Barry from the desk. That would have been a good title. Gooney nodded. Yes, it would. Good for you, Barry. I might change my title later, actually. You can do that. The title you give first is called the working title, and my working title is How Gooney Got a Room Mother. She looked down at herself. You know how usually in stories, I try to describe what the main character looks like and what she's wearing? The children nodded. They had heard Gooney tell many stories before. Well, she said, in this story, the main character is me. And as you can see, today I am wearing tap shoes, blue tights, red Bermuda shorts, and an embroidered peasant blouse from Bavaria. Bavaria, murmured Felicia Ann. I never heard of Bavaria before. It's quite an interesting outfit, I think, Gooney said, but I've decided it would not be included in the story. This story is going to be an all dialogue story, no description. Class, Mrs. Pigeon said. She went to the board and wrote the word dialogue. For a few minutes, the room was silent except for the pages of the dictionaries turning. I found it, called Ben. He read aloud, words used by characters in a book or a story, Gooney said. I'm going to begin. There are only 2 characters in this story. One is Gooney and the other is, Oh, don't tell. She doesn't want you to tell, several children called. Mrs. X, Gooney Bird said. I'm calling her Mrs. X, and I'm starting my story with a sound effect. Listen. Ring, ring. Hello, Mrs. X said when she answered the telephone. Hello, said Gooney Bird Greene. I'm calling from Water Tower Elementary School. Yes, my goodness, is something wrong at the school? Asked Mrs. X. I think it was my mom, Keiko said. She always worries. She worries about chicken pox and unsanitary restrooms and earthquakes. My mom worries too, said Tricia. Mine worries about kidnappers and unfriendly dogs. Mine worries about undercooked hamburger, said Ben. Mine too, and swimming too soon after lunch, and wasps, said Chelsea. Not mine, Malcolm said glumly. Mine only worries about those triplets and diaper rash. Please tell their names, Malcolm. I love babies, Felicia Ann said in her soft voice. No, they're incognito. Class, Gooney Bird said impatiently, you are interrupting the story. Dialogue is supposed to flow along smoothly. Sorry, everyone replied. But you did remind me of something, how much all mothers worry about their children. So I'm going to interrupt the dialogue and insert something about that. What's that called when you do that? Asked Bernie. Gooney Bird thought, and then she shrugged. I don't know, she said, and she looked at the teacher. Mrs. Pigeon? Mrs. Pigeon thought, and then she said, that would be called the authorial intrusion. I think when the author intrudes to say something that's really isn't part of the story. But I'm not even going to write that on the board. It isn't important. Well, here I go, starting up again, Gooney Bird said. She took a deep breath and continued. All mothers worry about their children, not only human mothers, but animals. Once I had a cat who was always looking for her kittens and got very upset if they strayed too far. Now picture if that cat was human and her children went to school every day and she didn't know what was going on at school, and suddenly someone called and said, Gooney Bird stopped and looked around. Malcolm had started rolling his paper again, and Felicia Ann, seated on the floor, had her head down on her knees. Chelsea yawned. Sorry, Gooney Bird said. That's why authors shouldn't intrude. It's boring. Back to the dialogue. No, Mrs. X, said Gooney Bird. There is nothing to worry about. I'm calling with a request. And what might that be? Not a solicitation for money, I hope. Mrs. X's voice sounded suspicious. I bet it's my mom, said Beanie. She hates when the phone rings and it's someone. Gooney Bird glared at Beanie. Sorry, Beanie said. No, I'm calling to tell you that you have been selected for a great honor. Right. The last time I got that call, they told me I had won a trip to Las Vegas, Mrs. X said. But it turned out that I was supposed to pay taxes and handling charges and buy a membership in something, I think a health club. It's my mother, Barry announced loudly. I'm sure it's my mother. No, it's mine, said Tyrone. She almost bought a timeshare in Mexico, and it was a big scam. It's my mother, Nicholas and Tricia said together. Gooney Bird glared at all of them. When the room fell silent, she continued. Gooney Bird explained very patiently. No, she said, this is truly a great honor, not a scam at all. You have been chosen as room mother for Mrs. Pigeon's second grade class. Mrs. X was silent for a moment. She was dumbfounded. She was overcome. Are you still there? Gooney Bird asked. Yes, said Mrs. X. So may I tell everyone that you said that? Said what? Asked Mrs. X. Yes, you said yes. I only meant yes, I'm still here. Please, please say yes, Gooney Bird said, because then I get to be Squanto. Mrs. X still didn't speak. And the principal will stop bugging Mrs. Pigeon, Gooney Bird added. The principal is doing that? Asked Mrs. X in an outraged voice. Indeed, he is, Gooney Bird replied. Mrs. X didn't speak. The only thing you have to do is provide cupcakes. And you can come to the Thanksgiving pageant if you want and sit in the seat of honor. And also, Gooney Bird looked at Mrs. Pigeon. I hope you don't mind. I said the next thing without asking your permission. What is that? Mrs. Pigeon asked. I hope you didn't say she'd be paid. You know we don't pay anything. I'll continue, Gooney Bird said. Also, Mrs. Pigeon, who wrote quite a fine song about succotash, will compose a second song, and its title will be Room Mother. Mrs. Pigeon began to laugh. All right, she said, I can do that. Gooney Bird looked relieved. She continued, and Gooney Bird told Mrs. X, we will all sing the song to you at the end of the Thanksgiving pageant. There was silence on the other end of the telephone. Then Gooney Bird looked at the class. Guess the next word, she said. Suddenly, they all shouted. They'd heard from Gooney Bird how important the word suddenly could be. You got it, Gooney Bird continued. Suddenly, Mrs. X started to laugh, and she said, yes, I'll do it. Thank you, Gooney Bird told her. On one condition, Mrs. X added. What is that? Until Thanksgiving, I'm incognito. My lips are sealed, said Gooney Bird. The end. The class clapped. Gooney Bird bowed, and Mrs. Pigeon smiled. Gooney Bird, she said, you are Squanto, for sure. All right, I'm going to stop.